including Prime Minister's questions, Politics Live.
It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
As the United States are applying tariffs worth $28 billion, we are responding with countermeasures worth 26 billion euros.
The EU is retaliating to President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium. Should the UK do the same? Also,
Ukraine, ceasefire, just agreed to a little while ago. Now we have to go to Russia and hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road.
the US and Ukraine are now back on the same page, but how will Russia respond to their ceasefire plan? And
will she stand with us on this side of the House for equality under the law, or will it be two-tier justice with her and two-tier Keir?
I've made it very clear I'm going to consider the role and the powers of the Sentencing Council, and if I need to legislate, I won't hesitate to do so.
the Justice Secretary and the opposition criticise plans for new guidance on sentencing. But are they respecting the independence of the judiciary? Labour MPs head to Downing Street to talk about welfare cuts. Will they support the Prime Minister's plans? And Keir Starmer faces Kemi Badenoch at PMQs. We'll have it live at noon. Joining me, Labour peer and barrister Helena Kennedy, Conservative MP David Reid, Andrew Fisher, columnist at the iPaper and a former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, and journalist and broadcaster Inaya Folarin Iman. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Well, you heard and saw the EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen in the headlines. Let's show you the story in BBC News. The EU retaliates after Trump tariffs on steel and aluminium take effect. Yes, it is the report that President Trump has pushed ahead with tariffs on all steel imports into the US at 25%, and the EU has retaliated with counter tariffs amounting to 26 billion euros. Now, the Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has said that the decision was disappointing and he would keep all options on the table, but hasn't and isn't at the moment taking immediate retaliatory action. The Conservatives have said that Donald Trump's decision shows the Labour government has no plan. My opening question, starting with you, Helena. Are they right, the Conservatives? Is the government's approach towards Donald Trump working when it comes to trade?
Well, I do think that that business of our no longer being part of the European Union provides a different kind of doorway into the White House. And I think that it's possible that, that conversations can take place which are separate from the European Union, which may in fact get some sort of retreat from the American position with regard to doing it to everybody. I don't know, but I think that they're trying to keep those doors all open, and that seems to me sensible strategically. To try to make sure that, you know, you've still got some leeway in having conversations about how this is going to affect Britain and how we wouldn't want to get into a sort of retaliatory position with them because we have such a special relationship.
But can you understand why the opposition is saying that Keir Starmer has made so much of being a bridge when it comes to Ukraine? And we'll talk about Ukraine and Russia in terms of the peace deal in a moment. But on trade, they've got nothing to show for that.
Well, at the moment, that's absolutely right. But the hope is that there will be some difference made by not being part of the European Union. There's no doubt
because of a trade deal that might come down.
Donald Trump has got a particular bee in his bonnet about the European Union, which he's always felt that somehow he feels antagonistic towards. And so our not being part of that may provide some sort of different avenue for a separate deal.
David, what do you think? Do you think it's working? Do you think the approach is right? And that we shouldn't retaliate yet with, or at all, in fact, with tariffs?
So I think it's really interesting that the Republican Party, before being elected into office, went through all the hard thinking to understand what their economic policy was, what their foreign policy was, and then they told the world, and no one believed them. So
they flip-flopped quite a lot on tariffs, haven't they?
But President Trump said tariffs repeatedly through the election. So for us, I completely agree with you. I think not to wade into the B-word debate again, but being outside of the European Union now gives us more flexibility to be able to negotiate with the US. The key point with that, though, is that the Prime Minister was out in the Oval Office very recently.
Yeah.
They were talking about carve-outs so that we wouldn't be affected by any tariffs being imposed, but that hasn't happened. I think from my position now, the world is changing at such a rapid rate, we need to start producing a lot more of what we need back at home, whether that be food, energy, and steel will be a key component in that. And I'm sure we'll go on to speak about defence and Ukraine.
But broadly, you think the approach is right? As you say, was in the Oval Office. You think the Prime Minister's going around this the right way with Donald Trump?
So I want to, and my role in opposition will be to press into the government's plans now about a free trade deal. We've had big words and big statements about it, but I've not seen much progress being made.
I mean, interestingly, the Shadow Trade Secretary, Andrew Griffith, your colleague, has said today that he would have camped out in Washington and Mar-a-Lago until we had a deal. So presumably the Conservatives think that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, should be cozying up to Donald Trump even more.
Listen, that's to not take any account of the fact that at the moment the toughest thing on the agenda is to do with war, and so that's been a major thing. The idea of camping out and making yourself a pest at Mar-a-Lago seems to me the last thing that you want to be doing.
So I disagree on that. So this is a fundamental difference now between the Labour front bench and the opposition front bench. The Shadow Business Secretary has come from a business background. He knows how to get stuff done. The President of the United States is a businessman, and this is how things are playing out at the moment.
Right, so you do agree he should be camped out outside Mar-a-Lago. It's a shame we can't see that at the moment. Do you think the UK should retaliate with tariffs like the EU?
I think what you have to realise is Trump uses tariffs as a bullying tactic to try and get a better deal for America. I agree with what David said, actually, at the outset. Trump has been very clear about what he wants. It's America first, and actually we're seeing it's not just America first, it's America only. He's prepared to pick fights with Canada, with the EU, all of America's natural allies, over what he sees as crudely in America's interest. I think actually it will do long-term harm to the US, as we're already seeing with their economy. And I think it will get worse if he continues down this route. But that's his own stupid fault. But what I think Britain should be doing is actually aligning with the EU, because the thing is, the EU can stand up to Trump, and you need to stand up to bullies. China did it, and actually you saw the tariffs came down, and you saw a bit of this. You saw Canada play hardball with it, actually, over their energy. And again, America backed down. It's gone down from 50% to 25%.
That's true, but aligning with the EU and then risking those 25% of tariffs continuing.
The EU, GDP-wise, is similar to the US. China is the world's biggest export economy. It can stand up to the US. The UK cannot.
As we saw with Canada, they've to some extent stood up to Trump, and there has been some movement there. So you don't have to be part of this enormous trading bloc in order to.
They've got more leverage, haven't they?
They've got more leverage.
Really, bear in mind where they are.
We're a very small steel exporter to the US. I don't think we're even in the top 5.
I still think that there are relationships that we have within the US. You know, Trump has already said that he would be open to a free trade deal. I think that we should I think that we should be utilising that relationship, and I do think that Starmer has been fairly good on that. And that ultimately, I think, is right that's been said in terms of what Trump has been pushing for a number of months, if not a number of years. And I don't think the actual principle that trying to shore up your own industries and focusing on kind of national industries is a principle that we should be so opposed to. I mean, we're not in the same era of unfettered globalisation that we have been for decades. And I think that countries kind of need to wake up to the fact that the world has really changed.
But we need to act in our own interest, not in the US's interest.
But what is in our own interest then, Andrew?
Our own interest is to protect our industries. And if the tariffs are being slapped on them by other countries, we need to respond in kind and protect our industries.
I completely agree with you on that now. The world is changing at such a rapid rate now. We need the ability to produce a lot more of what we need back here in the UK.
It's certainly changed if a Corbynista is in the same camp as the Tories.
The point I'm making with this is that because the world is changing so quickly, when we look at defence spending and looking at the need to produce domestic capability back here, produce enough of the food that we need, we saw global supply chains being hindered during the pandemic. Now, look, I'm a Conservative. I want free trade, but we have to be realistic about the world in which we live.
What about standing up to Trump in the way that Andrew has suggested, doing a Mark Carney, for example, who was really fighting talk. And I think in Ontario, they've gone even further with threats on electricity. Is this the sort of thing?
But Jo, you wait to the point where you really are getting it in the face. And at the moment, that isn't the situation in our relationship with the United States.
Although the steel industry is worried,
it doesn't bring joy to my heart watching my Prime Minister having to make nice to Mr. Trump, I have to say. But I do think that that is the nature of the game, given that we want to continue to have trading relationships and so on with the United States, as well as with Europe. And I do want us to remain close. I was always a Remainer. I want us to remain close to Europe. But this separateness that now exists could give us an edge on certain things. And I certainly think that you play that card. Mr. Trump is always talking about cards to play with. You play that card for as long as you can until it's been very clear that you ain't special. And a point may come where he'll make it clear to us that we're not special, and we'll wait and see.
So that reinforces my point now. Reinforces my point that rather than waiting around to find out what
go US camping, make a tent at Mar-a-Lago.
What US foreign policy is going to be like, we need to do much more back here in the UK. So we're not being reactionary. I would much rather create the weather here rather than just waiting around and see which way the wind's blowing.
I think your party should go and make a tent outside of Mar-a-Lago. That would be.
I can see you're tickled by this, Helena.
There are plenty of people living in tents thanks to the last Conservative government, but that's a different point. But I do think, I think Starmer shouldn't be picking fights with Donald Trump. I don't think, I mean, I can sit here and say he's a racist Oompa Loompa, but that isn't what Starmer should be saying. No. I think it's fair enough that he's kind of having this diplomatic relationship and trying to get him on side. Well, but in reality, you've got to be making kind of deals with other countries and building alliances quite flexibly, I think, in order to counter this, and other countries as well. It's not just the US. Well, look at when China dumped steel on the EU, and I think we were still just about in then, we put up tariffs on China because they were damaging European steel industries.
But China perhaps not in the same sort of view of ally.
No, indeed, but it takes huge trading blocks in order to counter other huge trading blocks. You can't do this on your own.
Let's talk about something where perhaps Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, the relationship with America, a relationship with Donald Trump, is bearing some fruit. And that is on the announcement overnight of this 30-day ceasefire, because apparently Jonathan Powell, the Prime Minister's envoy, national security advisor, was instrumental in certainly trying to pull that together from the Ukrainian side. You will have no doubt seen in the reports overnight on the news. Yesterday, these happened after talks in Saudi Arabia. It also means the US has said it will resume military aid and intelligence sharing, which it had paused with Kyiv. Let's have a look at the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and then Donald Trump, how they reacted.
Today, we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation. And hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians. And we hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball's now in their court.
Yes, because at the moment we haven't had a full sort of response from the Russians. Let's just hear what Donald Trump, the president, said about the deal.
Ukraine, ceasefire, just agreed to a little while ago. Now we have to go to Russia and hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road.
Ina, your reaction?
I mean, you really have to give it to Zelensky. I think a lot of political leaders, after the humiliation that he's experienced over the last few weeks, would really find it difficult to continue and face the Trump administration again. But he's really gone back, and there does seem to be, and perhaps that's true. But it does show that he is willing to put, the interests of Ukraine first. Of course, if this 30-day ceasefire is agreed, that's not necessarily the same as what the actual result is going to be. And we've already heard some things from Putin, such as no European troops. They don't seem to be very interested in giving back any kind of territory that they've seized. And so I think that what's really important now, especially from a UK standpoint, is that we don't we continue to hold European leaders' feet to the fire in terms of defence spending and also potentially putting European troops, because there needs to be some strength and leverage for Ukraine in order for them to get that lasting long peace.
I mean, this is the BBC News headline, UK help Ukraine and US reach ceasefire deal that I was just mentioning. According to government sources, a success, then you would regard it?
Well, let's wait and see what Russia says, because it's not a ceasefire until Russia signs up to it. And even then, that's not a lasting peace deal. And for peace to endure, it has to be a just settlement. And that does mean Russian troops withdrawing from Ukraine and giving up the territory they've stolen, as well as returning the 16,000 children that they've kidnapped from Ukraine as well. So there's a long way to go in these negotiations before we're at the point of a just settlement, which is the point Anaya was making. But I think, look, it's good we've got to this point. If we do get to a ceasefire, obviously that's good. Nobody wants to witness any more killing of conscripted troops on either side and civilians in Ukraine. That's a good thing, but it's in order for peace to endure, it has to be a just settlement, and that I'm not sure that the US is an honest broker in this.
Right, well, overnight, we've seen reports that Kyiv has been bombed hours after Ukraine said it was ready to accept the ceasefire. And we've also heard, as Anaya was commenting on, that reportedly Vladimir Putin is deliberately going to be making maximalist demands, things like, yes, no peacekeeping troops. And so where does it leave Keir Starmer's coalition of the willing? Is it right to push ahead with that while this is ongoing?
I think the Prime Minister has really, on this, played the most important role and been incredibly good at it. And it's the sort of thing that he would be good at, and I've known him for many years. I do think that it will be interesting to see what Putin's response may be. I mean, I think that the likelihood is that they will be cajoled into coming into a ceasefire for a period. But I think that the talk then will become very difficult. I mean, there's the interlocutor, Jonathan Powell, is a very interesting choice to be brought into all of this.
Because he was obviously introduced to the Blair.
I mean, he was in Northern Ireland, his experiences. But since that time, he's played an incredible role around the world, below the radar, in many different conflicts. And so I think that having him involved in the negotiations is really important. And the things that theatre of cruelty that we witnessed in the White House, of the disgraceful conduct towards Zelensky, and I think you're absolutely right. It speaks to so much about the man who's leading Ukraine, that he, in the interest of his people, has come back and sought to recreate that relationship. But he was trying to show Trump. He imagined that even Trump, would have the humanity to understand the torture of prisoners of war, the rape of women by Russian soldiers. I mean, in front of their children. And I mean, I'm involved with the President's office, and I've been advising on war crimes, particularly the taking of the children. And we're talking about many thousands of children having been taken into Russia and spread throughout the whole expanse of Russia. So that it's very difficult tracing them. We've got a number of them. There's been negotiations, again, under the radar. And we've got a whole set of children back, and they're being told while they're there that there is no such place as Ukraine, that they're really Russian.
But, I mean, you've explained it in primary colours here. On the basis of that, what do you think the likelihood is that Russia and Ukraine could find some sort of lasting peace?
I really think that there would have to be reparations of a serious kind, because, for example, the need for therapeutic help for those who've directly themselves suffered, the need for rebuilding of the infrastructure. I mean, there are warrants at the International Criminal Court. You can't just dismiss all of that. The war crimes have been horrifying.
Right. Well, what do you think the chances are, having heard what Helena has to say about the reality of war on the ground in Ukraine, the likelihood then of Russia paying reparations or just agreeing to a lasting peace?
I personally can't see it happening. The negotiation point that the Russians are coming forwards with now is completely out of kilter with what Ukraine and the US are saying. Now, look, I want peace more than anything, and I'm really happy that the Americans have put Ukraine back in a fighting position by reinstating military aid and
intelligence sharing.
However, as the US State Department have said, the ball is very much in Russia's course at the moment. And the things that Putin is saying around not allowing Ukraine to join any sort of international governmental organisations, about borders, I cannot see that moving forwards to reparations.
On the basis then of what you've just said, you can't really see it happening. And you mentioned defence spending a little earlier in the programme. What do you think should happen then?
So this is the fundamental point. Do we think Putin is going to stop? I don't think he is. The Americans know that the Europeans need to step up their defence spending, and we need to do a lot more to deter the brute that is Putin. Putin understands strength. And by not investing in defence over recent decades, because the threat hasn't been there...
Yes.
Okay, we need
14 years of which were under Conservative governments.
Look, we can talk about the peace dividend and the fact that the threat wasn't there.
That obviously went along to
1989. Okay, we are getting to the point now where the threat is clearly there, and we need to spark into action. The US has other strategic priorities, such as China, and we need to make sure that we can deter Putin.
Well, I mean, what was interesting is a former Defence Secretary under Conservative governments, Penny Mordaunt, has said that the Labour's current defence funding plans are nowhere near enough to deter Russian aggression. Keir Starmer has said that we'll get to 2.5% by 2027. It's going to come from cuts to international aid. But she went on to say we need to look at what the state is fundamentally doing and do less better, and do the things that only government can do. What should we stop doing, David?
So this is the politics now, and I'm on the Shadow Defence team. This is what we've been hounding the Defence Secretary with.
That's fine. I understand what you're saying on defence, but what should we stop doing? I mean, she was quite candid, although she didn't actually say what we should stop doing, in order to fund much more money going.
So the Prime Minister has already come forwards with taking 0.2% off international aid.
Yeah.
But, and the conversation that we'll have now, and the Labour Party are currently having, is around welfare. The welfare budget has ballooned since 2019. Now, there's causal factors. We had a really expensive pandemic, but we have seen a significant increase on people on incapacity benefits. Now, going back to that point, that the threat hasn't been there, so we've not had to spend on defence. We've been able to spend on places like the NHS and education. We're getting to the point now where we need to fundamentally go back to what states should be doing, which is looking after its borders and its citizens, and that means increasing defence spending.
So what? Shrinking, it seems.
Health and education as well, it seems.
And on welfare, just to be clear, because at the moment we don't know the shape exactly of the savings that have been reported, and we are told that is to balancing the books rather than going into defence. But if we take David's prospectus on, there would have to be cuts, wouldn't there?
If you take that, look, Labour set out how it's going to get to 2.5% by 2027 already. I don't agree with cutting international aid. I think that's counterproductive to our diplomacy and our soft power around the world, as it's sometimes called. You know, I think there is a fundamental thing. Look, Putin is a threat to his neighbours. He's not a threat in the way that Hitler was or the Soviet Union was perceived to be during the Cold War. He's been at war with Ukraine for 3 years now, nearly, I think. He's taken a fifth of Ukraine. This is not.
What about our NATO partners?
Look, I think there needs to be a much better coordination of our military spending throughout Europe. I think that's true. I think at the moment, part of the problem is we don't coordinate with France and Germany and others. We've all got our own systems, some of which are, I mean, our procurement, by the way, in the MOD over decades, this is across governments, has been appalling. We've bought tanks that don't go over sand. We've got aircraft carriers with no aircraft on them. It's been absolutely useless.
I've come from a military background. I worked in defence as well. And it goes back to that point that necessity is the mother of all of invention. The threat hasn't been there, OK? So it's been very difficult to adapt and innovate. So what we've seen in Ukraine is that warfare has changed rapidly. New technology such as artificial intelligence, drone warfare has changed.
Shape of that
and that's changing our mindset very quickly.
Yes, but should we do less of other things?
No, look, we've got much greater need. We've got more people in poverty. We've got more people that are homeless. We've got, massive backlogs in the NHS. No, we shouldn't be cutting any of that sort of stuff. We actually need to be investing more in that, which would actually pay dividends further down the line.
So how do we increase defence spending?
I don't think we should increase defence spending. I think we need to be a lot smarter with it, actually. And we need to coordinate with our European partners rather than thinking every country in isolation has its own military.
And many countries in Europe also believe that we should be increasing defence spending, are increasing defence spending.
Consensus at the moment. There is a shared reality that
party consensus on welfare cuts, and it's wrong as well. That doesn't mean it's a good thing.
The threat is there.
Well, let me ask you now, where would you cut if you agree with the defence spending going up beyond 2.5%? Where would you cut?
So firstly, on the international aid, I think Labour are completely right on this. I mean, when it comes to immediate disaster relief, such as what's going on in Gaza or Sudan, I think that makes complete sense that that's protected. But when the idea that, spending £100,000 on some kind of programme in a developing country is the thing that's going to prop up those societies. I think that we should be looking at trading with those countries and
stopping malaria or HIV vaccination programmes and so on. I mean, those things are important.
Let me just finish the point. I mean, what we saw with some of the cuts in USA, some of the spending was actually not going on a lot of things that people.
Some of that was a pack of lies, pretending that there were condoms going to Hamas, which was a fib.
Well, for example, one of them was about a transgender theatre in South America that actually didn't happen. But on the point of
go to the broader point.
Yes, it is a fact. But on the point about welfare, I think absolutely there should be cuts in welfare. I think the reality is, I mean, I did some work for the Mail on this last year in Clacton. I was speaking to young people that literally left school, went straight on out of work benefits for.
Not jobs.
And no, that wasn't the reason. I was speaking to them, and many of them were saying that they weren't ready for work or that they didn't want to work. And the idea that we have hundreds of thousands more young people. Can you stop interrupting me?
Yeah, let her make that point.
Hundreds of thousands of young people that are essentially being consigned to the economic scrap heap, when actually the reality is that they should be going to work, learning skills, developing professionally, and that's actually good for mental health.
I completely
that's
agree with
literally
you.
good for a sense.
Cutting education and health.
I didn't say anything about cutting education and health.
David.
In terms of welfare,
Never said that.
No.
In terms of welfare,
Hang on, Andrew. Let him finish her point, and I'll come back to you.
It's extremely important, and it's actually just quite unjust. I mean, the idea that by the end of the decade, £1 in every £4 in income tax is going to go to disability. I think a lot of people working think that that's just completely unfair.
I think, just to say, David was saying, I think if I paraphrase correctly, to cut welfare more, to go into defence. Did you say health and education?
No, I
You
didn't.
said the peace dividend allowed us to spend more on health and education.
Oh, right,
Now we need
okay.
to look at that.
All right.
I said that the peace dividend has allowed us to invest
It's more in health and
places like-
health and education.
And at
And
no
now you're
point
saying
did I
we
say-
need to look at that.
No.
No, he's not saying that.
So we need to look at that again.
What he said. I'm sure that a rerun of the tape would tell us who said what. But we've got to, what it seems to me is that we are going to need the whole situation of security and what's happening in our world is going to involve much greater investment by Britain, and whether it's the 2.5 or it increases, is going to be necessary. However, it just seems to me that Labour was elected on the basis that the folk out there felt they wanted to see an end to the misery they'd had with austerity over 14 years, and the Conservatives doing that to them. So what they want is more money spent on all these different things: healthcare, mental health care, on their young, on education and training of the young. And so, you can talk about. I too am concerned about our young not getting those opportunities.
And how would you fund it, Helena?
You have to fund. What you do is, have you seen the extraordinary business of our major banks, the profits they've made? Overwhelming profits in the last few years, and there's not been any talk about a windfall tax on them. And I'm just telling you, there are other things that you can do. And of course, the problem that Labour's got itself into is that they promised that they weren't going to tax the rich.
Yep.
And I've got to say now, I'm sorry, the rich has to bear more of the burden.
We'll let Inaya respond, and then I'll get you to and then we must move on.
I find it astonishing. This is the Labour Party. Of course, work and jobs and pride is central to what the Labour Party historically was. I think that what's immoral is the idea that people should be signed off on welfare indefinitely with almost no checks since the pandemic. The proportion of checks...
They're not signed off indefinitely with no checks.
The proportion of checks for people on certain benefits has collapsed since the pandemic, and that is you just deny these.
Hang on. Let me put a question to Andrew and perhaps Helena, and then we must move on, because I think we'll have a chance to go back to this in a moment. There is a split with Labour MPs, because there's also a group of Labour MPs who are urging the government to push ahead along similar lines to what Inaya is saying. So this is not a straightforward issue, is it, for Labour in a financial situation where they want to get people back into work, and they've got groups of MPs on both sides of the debate pushing?
And you notice the ones on that side of the debate, the ones that wrote that letter, are all the ones that were parachuted in by Keir Starmer. Okay. Now, so, I mean, it's not surprising they say whatever the leadership wants. But what I would say is, look...
give us a break.
The welfare... they were. You look at the names.
All right, Andrew.
But look at the welfare...
Stick to the principles.
The welfare system in this country is a thermometer for what's going wrong in the labour market, the housing market, in skills and training.
All right.
And until you sort out those things,
the incentives
you will
are
not
all wrong
bring
in the
down...
welfare system.
It's nothing to do with incentives
We'll come back to the idea of incentives.
Sort out those other areas of the public, industrial strategy, skills training, housing system,
can I just say,
you will reduce the welfare budget without any cuts.
I really think that we should be looking at the young, and the idea that our young are staying at home and are suffering from mental health problems.
And
look at the NHS waiting list.
And what you have to do...
Work helps mental health issues.
Is you have to really invest
have to be
in
jobs.
training, Stop talking over people. That's not nice. And listen, the business is we want to look after those young and to get them into the workplace,
right.
and it's going to help with mental health issues and so on. But you have to invest in it.
Well,
the money has to come from somewhere, and it has to stop seeing this business where we can't look at taxing the rich. Yeah. We've got to tax the rich.
All right. Well, we could have clearly spent the whole
that.
programme talking about welfare, but we're going to pause for a moment on that particular subject and talk about sentencing. I think we can show you a headline that says the sentencing body defends changes after two-tier row. There it is in BBC News. It all kicked off last week because the updated guidelines, due to come into force actually next month in April, says a court should order a pre-sentence report into an offender's life and background if they are from an ethnic or cultural minority, facing the possibility of jail for the first time, a woman, pregnant, or a carer for a dependent relative. It said it should also take in other factors, such as if the offender is transgender, disabled or an addict. But both the Justice Secretary and the Shadow Justice Secretary have said it would lead to what they call two-tier justice. Let's have a listen.
In 21 days' time, by the Justice Secretary's own admission, we will have two-tier justice. Her plan to fix this won't come into effect for a year. That's unacceptable.
We will never stand for a two-tier approach to sentencing, but I am actually getting on with fixing the problem rather than looking for a bandwagon to jump on. That is why I have already written to the Sentencing Council. I will be meeting with them later in this week, and I have made it very clear I will consider their role and their powers, and if I need to legislate, I will do so.
Oh, well, she's going to legislate if she has to do so. Just to say, that was an exchange in the Commons yesterday. That was Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, and Robert Jenrick for the Conservatives, her opposite there in the chamber. But, Helena, they're at an arm's length, independent, the Sentencing Council. Do you back Shabana Mahmood's statement that she will legislate and overrule them?
And it won't happen. And it won't happen, and I'll tell you why. Because justice is done, and I've spent my life in the courts, justice is best done when the judge has the best information possible about the person appearing in front of him. The women who end up in jail almost invariably have themselves been the victims of crime, often sexual abuse, often domestic violence in their home lives and so on. And many of them shouldn't be in prison. That's not what they need. They need alternatives to prison. And that's one of the things, is that if judges, often because of the pressures on the courts just now, it's not been possible to look into the backgrounds of people who really have problems that should be dealt with in a different way.
Is she right, though, to threaten Shabana Mahmood that she would overrule or legislate to overrule?
She's being driven into this corner by this particularly pernicious thing that's going on inside the Conservative Party just now, which is to be divisive.
Okay.
To say, we're doing terrible things.
We'll use driving analogy.
Well, let him respond.
Driven in. The Justice Secretary has been asleep at the wheel for the last 7 months. The fact that she's been sending representatives into these discussions and the fact that she's only found out about it recently shows that there is mismanagement within the department.
Well, what were the Conservatives doing in 2022? The Sentencing Council have said they wrote to them and said it's been live since 2022.
There is a big difference between having discussions and an actual policy coming out. So this is not how this country works. This is not how this country works. The law is the law. If you break the law, then you face the consequences of the judicial system.
Why do you think it'll lead to a two-tier system? In other words, you think that certain offenders will get more lenient sentences?
Yeah, definitely. And look, and I will defer to you because you have a strong legal background.
And you haven't got a legal background at all. I mean, I'm just telling you that lots of the more that a judge knows, the better the information.
Yes, I understand.
Don't talk over each other because the audience can't hear.
The better the outcome. We know all the research is showing that many of the women, particularly in prison, are getting two-tier justice because they're being sent to prison when, in fact, they should not be sent to prison.
Do you agree that this will be a subjective process, judge by judge?
It's not subjective. Judges do it based on. I mean, they have sentencing guidelines. They have years of experience which they bring to bear on it, and so you really are disrupting a judicial process which is really helped by.
Well, let David respond, and also just to remind you, Shabana Mahmood agrees.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, on some of it.
No, that's not.
Well, hang on, I'll come back to you.
I'm going to look into it.
Right.
This is a fundamental difference to the law now.
It's just nonsense.
Do you not agree? No, really.
Talking absolute
Well, let me go.
nonsense.
Why does it lead? Would it lead to two-tier sentencing? Pre-sentence reports. This is from the Sentencing Council itself.
Yeah.
I said it will, as Helena has suggested, it will inform them. It will inform them of decisions in a system which has perhaps been skewed up until now.
Yeah.
The problem is there is a perception that it could lead to some offenders being treated more leniently.
So, a few things. Firstly, I mean, the idea that the courts are completely free from political or democratic scrutiny, I just think that that is ridiculous. People should be able to have an opinion on things like this. And I totally agree about pre-sentencing reports, but that should be done across the board. Everybody then should have a right to have more information. I think the problem that people have is specifically on the immutable characteristics of being an ethnic minority, religious or cultural minority, or being transgender. The idea that those groups specifically should be the ones that have those reports is what has fueled the idea of two-tier justice. And when it comes to the fact that, for example, it is black men are more likely to get a longer sentence for the same crime. Actually, if you look at some of the deeper reasons, it's much more complex than that. So, for example, black men are more likely to plead not guilty for crimes that they actually went on to commit and were found guilty for. And that often actually leads to a longer sentence if you plead not guilty and are found to be guilty. Now, we have to look at why they are more likely to plead not guilty. Now, I think actually some of it is to do with this myth, I think, of institutional racism within the justice system, which has actually fueled a sense of mistrust and distrust amongst some ethnic minority people. And hold on, let me just finish here. So I think rather than putting your thumb on the scale and saying that ethnic minorities therefore should potentially get a lower sentence, I think, hold on, we have to look at the deeper reasons as to why. Right. And then it's not just ethnic minorities, religious minorities. Why should someone that's transgender have this, but someone that isn't?
But is it about being lenient?
The law, and if you break it, you are held accountable.
Yes, but people behind Andrew.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, you can.
Let me let Andrew. Yeah, let me let Andrew
talk over me. Sorry.
Yeah, stop it, all of you.
Look, I think in all seriousness, there used to be a cross-party consensus on this. I remember Theresa May in 2017 commissioning the Lamy Review into the injustice within the criminal justice system that meant that black men especially, but also Asian men, were more likely to be arrested for the same crime, were more likely to be charged for the same crime, were more likely to get a longer sentence for the same crime. That was a cross-party consensus. There is MOJ...
I'm just giving you an example of one of the reasons that might be.
Can I just finish my point? You've already said what you think that is. Because that is... And there used to be a cross-party consensus. I think it's so sad that now the criminal justice system has come forward with plans to tackle what is in existence a two-tier justice system now that pre-exists, that disfavours black and Asian men in particular. Well, it does. Your own Ministry of Justice data under a Conservative government said that.
Well, all right,
the former Prime Minister said that.
Let's come back in a year's time and we'll have this discussion. So these effects are going to come in. These effects are going to come in 21 days. Now, because there's been mismanagement by the Lord Chancellor, the effects that she's trying to change won't come in for a year. So this two-tier system will be in place. So we will see the effects. So let's have a discussion in a year to see how it affects.
The important thing, though, here is you don't think Shabana Mahmood really believes that there is going to be a two-tier system, that she's under pressure here.
What I think is that this is generic doing that whole culture wars divisive stuff.
Because he said it's anti-Christian.
No, she doesn't. The thing was, let me tell you, that over the many years that I've been in practice, getting reports on people was always helpful.
Yeah.
Because women won't say.
Everyone should have a pre-sentencing report.
Yes. And the problem is that in recent times it's stopped.
Right.
Because of the pressure on the system. And so what the sentencing council are saying is there are some categories where you really have to know, because so often women, they're done for shoplifting, but it turns out that actually they've been in domestic violence and a terrible
What about transgender?
Because do you know about the level of discrimination and pain that is suffered by transgender people in our society?
Yeah, no,
and so it may be that somebody is having a mental breakdown because of the way they've been treated. You want to know that stuff.
But Helena, will it lead to a judge having a pre-sentence report on somebody that you have used as an example?
Maybe
right. Well, I mean, and everyone would agree with that, no doubt. But would that mean that a judge who might have looked at a case and sent them to jail will not?
Let me just tell you, Mr. Grayle, getting reports involves experienced probation officers preparing a report. Grayling put a scythe through the probation service. He destroyed the probation service. And so during the Conservative years, we've seen a diminution of it. So you can't have everybody getting a report. So that what they're saying is, do take a look at women, because the background of most of the women in prison, do take a look at people, ethnic minorities, in case there's something that's...
I think a lot of people would actually have a lot of sympathy when it comes to women, when it comes to pregnant individuals, people that have people that have disabilities or addictions. I think what people have a fundamental problem with when it comes to things like religion, cultural minority or race.
But what about Andrew's point that the system is already skewed against people within those groups?
Agree with that.
Right.
Theresa May agreed with it.
Yeah, but I don't agree with Theresa May on this.
No, that's fine. You don't have to. But what I'm saying is it's a sad state that, 6-7 years ago, there was a cross-party consensus on this. Nobody disagreed with that. And
actually,
now,
many people...
it's just this cultural...
There were many people...
engineer equality of outcome over equality of process.
Shouldn't we have equality of outcome in the law?
Fundamentally wrong.
Shouldn't we have equality of outcome under the law?
And it goes back to that point. Judges will interpret things in different ways, and it is subjective to a point.
It's not...
OK? It is subjective to a point.
Got sentencing
OK, so
guidelines.
The process then needs to be fair, and that needs to be applied to everyone. And it goes back to that key point. If you break the law, you should say,
sameness.
regardless of who you are,
you
should face the consequences.
You will.
Of the law.
Well, can I just say,
this doesn't change that.
Helena doesn't think it's going to happen. Hang on.
Doesn't
Helena doesn't think it's going to happen, that the sentencing guidelines or the council will be
let me tell you why.
overruled. So we will have, in the words of both Shabana Mahmood, potentially, and Robert Jenrick, and say we will have two-tier justice. Is that a problem politically? No, I'm not saying it. I'm using their words.
Yes,
is that a problem
politically? I'm afraid.
Right, on
but the terrible thing about this, Joe, is that it's so divisive and and it's basically telling the public out there that a special deal is going to be done for these categories of people.
That's not true.
And it's not that. And the system, the justice system, please. The justice system is really on its knees because of the Conservatives over these last 14 years.
Nonsense.
Totally.
Absolute nonsense.
And they have destroyed the probation service, and they have reduced the numbers of courts, and they have really had a terrible effect on...
David, if that's your argument, the next point isn't to create protected groups then, because that's all we can afford.
You want every single person to be given the same sentence.
There should be equality across the board in terms of process.
Irrespective of the fact that a woman may have 3 children and therefore those children are going to be taken into care, that she'll lose her home if she's given us a short sentence rather than dealing with her as an alternative. You want that information before the court, and that's how you get justice. And justice obviously is not high priority for you.
This is ingrained on how this country works, and I knock on doors every week.
Make it the same for everybody.
And it should be the same for everyone, regardless of who you are. If you are in the House of Lords, or if you come from
the rich man and the poor man, treat them exactly the same.
The legal system should apply the same.
Even though he gets to be able to afford a lawyer that the other person can't afford.
We're going to leave it there because we're about to return to welfare, you'll be delighted to know. But first of all, you can now listen to Politics Live on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. If you want to listen to this fascinating debate again, just go to the live dial at the top of the BBC Sounds homepage and tap on live news. Perhaps we can go into the chamber, which will no doubt be filling up. We can see Nia Griffith, I think, there at the dispatch box. It's only a few minutes now to Prime Minister's questions. Yes, almost full there in the chamber before Kemi Badenoch takes her place and asks questions of the Prime Minister. I said we would return to the issue of welfare, and that's because I think you can see pictures of MPs, Labour MPs, heading into number 10 this morning. They've definitely been trying to hold meetings with MPs on both sides, I think, or on all sides of this debate. The Prime Minister has, though, called the welfare bill indefensible as he looks to make cuts amid expectations that the Chancellor's financial buffer, headroom, whatever you want to call it, is going to be wiped out, and it is dividing MPs. We heard from one on BBC News who is unhappy about the potential cuts to benefits earlier today. Let's have a listen. Nadia Whittam.
You have to understand that people are experiencing this against the backdrop of disabled people, single parents and anyone receiving social security being vilified throughout the 2000s and the 2010s, this narrative of strivers versus skivers, and we cannot go back there. It was wrong when David Cameron cut welfare. It would be wrong for us to do that now.
Well, you can see the difficulty there being posed for Nadia Whittam, but others are much more favourable, as we were saying earlier. They would like the government to push ahead because, in the words of Jo White, who is the Labour MP for Bassetlaw, she says, "I see it as a moral duty to change people's lives." And she was talking more broadly about worklessness being entrenched in some families and some communities. Which side are you on, Helena?
I want to see, I really do want to see the young not staying at home. I want them money to be put into training and so on.
And would you be in favour of the government making savings, making cuts?
I want some adjustment in the way that the system is working on that. But it's not going to be cheaper because I don't want to see the taking money out of training and opportunities of education and so on. And when we've got people who, after COVID, have basically got used to the idea that they stay at home.
And so much more here than other comparable European countries, it seems, in terms of the numbers.
But I think that listen, it's not that we're more generous on welfare. There are many European countries that are more generous on welfare. But all I'm saying is that we have a problem, and it has. I don't know why it is, and I'm sure that more experienced persons than I could tell you why. But I do think that we should be concerned about our young, and we should be trying to find ways of dealing with it. Something we agree on. All right, but I do think that the money should not. I think that Rachel Reeves should say, the time has come to break this pledge on tax, to look
I don't think she's going to do that, I'm afraid. I should disappoint you.
I think the Labour Party will win a lot of favour in the public and gain a lot of support if they make it a moral mission of this government to get 1 million people back into work post the pandemic.
Well, they will get a lot, and that will save money.
Look, if 1 million more people can get into jobs, that's great. We've got 1.6 million people unemployed. It's been going up actually for modestly.
So why are we bringing in hundreds of thousands people into immigration?
Just 1 minute. Hold on. I can only answer one question at once. Sorry. But I'm happy to deal with both.
Yeah, all right.
Look, we have actually 4.6 million people who are underemployed on the wider measure of unemployment, and we have just over 800,000 vacancies in the economy. So clearly that doesn't go in. There are not enough jobs at the moment anyway. Plus, we have skills shortages in a number of areas where the people who are unemployed do not fill the skills gaps of what the jobs
Should
are
people
available.
be pushed more back into work?
Well, look, it depends who you're talking about. Look, do young people who have just come out of school or college need to be encouraged into work? Of course they do, and they need to be supported into doing so. We need more skills training to do that. We need more support. But what the Labour government is talking about at the moment is cutting personal independence payment for disabled people.
All right, I'm afraid it's time for PMQs.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the progress in talks between Ukraine and the United States. We must now redouble our efforts to get a lasting, secure peace. And, Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, I'll convene international leaders to discuss how we can make further progress. Can I also pay tribute to the bravery and dedication of all those responding to the ship collision off the East Yorkshire coast? Our thoughts, and I'm sure of the whole House, are with the family of the crew member who is sadly presumed dead. Mr. Speaker, this week we introduced landmark legislation to get Britain building, paving the way to restoring the dream of home ownership for working people across the country. We're also driving forward our Employment Rights Bill, the biggest boost to workers' rights in a generation. That's our plan for change in action. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mike Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Russia has abducted at least 19,000 Ukrainian children and transferred them to Russia. They have been told that their parents don't love them, they've been placed in Russian homes, and they have been re-educated. For this despicable crime and others, the International Criminal Court has issued 6 arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and his gang. I note the Prime Minister's previous fulsome support for the ICC, and I also note his comments just last night about the support that the UK will offer to Ukraine in achieving a just and lasting peace. Will the Prime Minister confirm to the House that British peacekeeping troops will only be deployed to Ukraine if the peacekeeping deal includes both the return of Ukraine's children and Putin's prosecution?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, firstly, I thank you for raising this issue because it is an absolutely terrible case of abduction and kidnapping. And when we say a lasting, just settlement or peace in Ukraine, it must, of course, involve dealing with this issue. And we are, as he would expect, raising it continually with our allies.
Ron Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Telford and Britain voted for change in July. Yet this week we saw the bizarre spectacle of the Conservatives attempting to bring back the Rwanda policy, clinging onto a gimmick that cost the British taxpayers £700 million, yet only sent 4 volunteers to Rwanda. As Labour works to secure our borders through our plan for change, does the Prime Minister agree with me? It's quite clear the party opposite have done absolutely nothing.
Well, he's quite right. They ran an open borders experiment that saw numbers go up to almost 1 million. And the leader of the opposition was the cheerleader, thanking herself for the lobbying that she did. The Rwanda scheme, yes, Mr. Speaker, £700 million of taxpayers' money to remove 4 volunteers. What a contrast. We've got the flights off. 19,000 people removed who shouldn't be here. As with the NHS, with prisons, the economy, everything else, we're clearing up the mess that they lost.
Even the opposition can be better off.
Later today, the Prime Minister is meeting the family of Sir David Amess. Sir David gave this House and our country 40 years of service. I hope the Prime Minister will agree that getting the response to his murder right is vital, not just to his family, but to our democracy. Mr. Speaker, every week I speak to businesses who are letting go of staff or closing. Has the Prime Minister been given an estimate of how many people will lose their jobs because of his budget?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, just on the question of Sir David, he was a deeply loved and respected colleague, and behind me is the plaque, as is the plaque to Joe Cox in front of me. And I know this was deeply felt by the House, but particularly, as I acknowledged at the time, by the party opposite, who lost a colleague and a friend in the most awful of circumstances. Mr. Speaker, I am meeting the Amess family later on today, and will make sure that they get answers to the questions that they ask. Mr. Speaker, in relation to businesses, I'm really pleased to say we've got thousands of new jobs into the economy. We've got more investment in the last 20 years, an absolute record. Wages are up higher than prices. 3 interest rate cuts, the best boost for the cost of living for a very long time.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister needs to get out more. Inflation is up, and estimates of job losses are between 130,000 and 300,000. Okay. His tax rises are hurting every sector of the economy. Things are getting worse for nurseries. Nurseries are writing to stressed parents right now, telling them that fees will go up because of his jobs tax. Can he explain how more expensive childcare is good for the economy or for working families struggling to make ends meet?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're putting in childcare. Look at the breakfast clubs, 2 in her constituency. But she's rather forgetting the £22 billion black hole that they left, that we had to deal with. That's why we had to take the necessary but right measures we did in the budget. And what's her response? Not that she'd reverse them. Oh, no, she doesn't say that. She attacks what we've done, but she doesn't say she would reverse it because she wants all the benefits of our budget in return to investment, but she doesn't want to pay for it. That's how we got into the mess in the first place.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is out of touch because he should know that nurseries are charging over £2,000 for full-time care. That's £24,000 a year after tax, and he's talking about 60p breakfast clubs. He has no idea what people out there are experiencing, and it is not just the families. Even councils must pay his jobs tax. To cope with it, the average council tax bill is increasing by over £100 in April, after he promised to freeze it. Hard-working families' money is going to the Chancellor instead of social care and fixing potholes. Why should these families pay more for less?
Well, she really shouldn't denigrate what she calls, I think, 60p breakfast clubs. She should be welcoming them. And she asked about council tax, Mr. Speaker. The Tories put up council tax every year for 12 years. Their manifesto, Tory LGA manifesto, government should remove the caps on council tax. And then Hampshire Council, Tory, wanted a 15% increase. We said no. Slough Council, again, Mr. Speaker, Tory, wanted 3%. We said no. Windsor and Maidenhead, Tory, now Lib Dem, wanted 25%. We said no. We're the ones that are doing the right things to get this country on the right track.
Mr. Speaker, the point is he promised to freeze, and they are going up. And if he wants to talk about councils, let's look at Liverpool or maybe Birmingham, where the rubbish is piling up so high, people vote Labour and all they get is trash, just like what he's saying at the dispatch box. People all over the country are suffering, not just in Birmingham. Millions of elderly people have had their winter fuel payments snatched away. At the same time, care home fees are set to go up by a devastating £3,000 because of his jobs tax. How does he expect pensioners on a fixed income to make ends meet?
Mr. Speaker, this is why it's so important that wages are up higher than prices. That's why it's so important that the interest rates are coming down. This is the biggest boost for the cost of living for a very, very long time. What we're doing is picking up and fixing the mess that they left.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is not looking at what is happening out there. Every day I speak to businesses who are telling us that they think that they are going bust. And as if businesses and families didn't have enough to worry about, supermarkets say food prices will increase by over 4% because of the jobs tax. And that's before we get to the immoral family farms tax on the very farmers who work so hard to produce our food. What does the Prime Minister have against farmers anyway? Does he not see that his budget is killing farming in this country, and he is making life so much harder for everyone else?
Mr. Speaker, the budget provided £5 billion for farming over the next 2 years. That is a record amount. We've set out the roadmap for farming, which has been welcomed by farmers. And many thousands of farms have benefited from the farming schemes. But she talks about prices. Wages are going up higher than prices. That's the first in a long time that's happened. So for families across the country, they're better off under Labour.
He's got no answers today. What the farmers are complaining about is the sustainable farming incentive, which he has just scrapped or withdrawn. They are making mistakes with this budget. And that's why in 2 weeks, the Chancellor will come to this House to present an emergency budget the Prime Minister said we would not need. They will try and make out it's because of global events, but the truth is they trash the economy with their bad choices. They said they'd look after pensioners. Then they snatched winter fuel payments. They said that they would be pro-business, but they hiked taxes on jobs. And he, Mr. Speaker, he promised to freeze council tax, but it's going up by £100. This is a high-tax, low-growth, job-killing government. Will he use the emergency budget to fix the mess he's made?
Mr. Speaker, inflation under them 11%, £22 billion black hole, a mini budget that made us the laughing stock of the world, and they want to give lectures on the economy to us. No, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With 1 in 8 young people across the country not in education, employment or training, people in rugby are worried about a wasted generation. Too many people with disabilities and health conditions are not getting the help that they need to get into work. So will the Prime Minister set out how this government will give everyone who is able to work the support they need, provide compassion to those who can't work, and fix the broken welfare system left behind by, you guessed it, the Conservatives?
I thank him for raising this issue. Mr. Speaker, I come from a family that dealt with disability through my mother and brother over many years, so I do understand the concerns that have been raised by him. But we inherited a system which is broken, it is indefensible economically and morally, and we must and we will reform it. We will have clear principles, Mr. Speaker. We will protect those who need protecting. We will also support those who can work back to work. But Labour is the party of work. We are also the party of equality and fairness.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by giving a shout-out for Young Carers Action Day today, but I promise the House I will not sing. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly spoken about the need to get more people into work, and he repeated that now, so people have more dignity, we can get the economy going, and we can cut the benefits bill after the disgraceful legacy left by the Conservatives.
You were there for 5 years.
But does the Prime Minister recognise that for many disabled people, the best way to help them into work is to support them properly with more special equipment, with training, with better healthcare, and so on? And will he also today calm anxieties that he himself has raised for many of us, that the disability benefits for people who simply cannot work will not be cut?
Mr. Speaker, we will, of course, as I've just said, the principles, we will, of course, support those who need support, but also help those who can work into work. They'll be the guiding principles. But what we've inherited is shocking, and they ought to be silent. 1 in 8 young people not in education, work or training. That is a lost generation. That is their inheritance. They've got plenty to say now. They did nothing for 14 years and left this in terrible inheritance.
And Davey, Mr. Speaker, turning to international issues, can I congratulate the Prime Minister on helping to secure the restoration of US military and intelligence support for Ukraine? But can I press him on progress to persuade President Trump against damaging metal tariffs already hitting British industry? The Prime Minister knows that we on these benches believe he must be more robust with President Trump, like the Europeans and like the Canadians. So will the Prime Minister fly out to Canada as soon as possible to show their new Prime Minister and the Canadian people that Britain stands with its Commonwealth allies against Trump's threats and against Trump's tariffs?
Well, Canada is an ally and a very important ally too, and I've spoken to our allies on many occasions about the situation in Canada. On the question of tariffs, obviously, like everybody else, I'm disappointed to see global tariffs in relation to steel and aluminium. But we will take a pragmatic approach. We are, as he knows, negotiating an economic deal which covers and will include tariffs if we succeed, but we will keep all options on the table.
Claire Hanna.
Hi, Ila Fadra, Conadív, agus Shock na Gilga, Fosta, Desh Con Changa, agus our culture, Kellaroo, or Fodandone. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody, and happy Irish Language Week as well, an opportunity to use Irish language and culture across the world. It's an increasingly turbulent world, Prime Minister, with relationships and norms turned upside down over recent weeks, and that's why I congratulate the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach for re-establishing warm and firm relationships at their summit last week, and it's reassuring for all of us to know that whatever our constitutional future, that bond is lasting and refreshed. Will the Prime Minister join me in wishing a happy St. Patrick's Day to all who value our shared bonds? And can I take this opportunity to invite him to Belfast in August 2027, which was announced this week as the host of the Fleadh na hÉireann for the first time?
Well, can I join her in wishing everybody celebrating a very happy St. Patrick's Day? Mr. Speaker, she's right. We need a strong and settled relationship between the United Kingdom and Ireland, and the need for that has never been greater, which is why I was delighted to host the Taoiseach in Liverpool last week at our first annual UK-Ireland summit. We've turned the page, started a new era for our relationship with Ireland, and I'd be very happy to go to Belfast in 2027. I want to go much sooner than that.
Andrew Stone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In just 20 days' time, new sentencing guidance will come into effect that the Justice Secretary has already conceded will be two-tier in its nature. It will mean that the colour of your skin or the religion you have can give you leniency in the eyes of the law and will plunge public confidence in the judiciary into crisis. But it is avoidable. We Conservatives have tabled a bill that, if backed on Friday, can stop this guidance in its tracks. So will the Prime Minister, will he now overrule his Justice Secretary and confirm here and now that he will back this bill, or will he simply step aside and prove he has in fact been two-tier Kia all along?
Well, everyone should be equal before the law. That is why the Lord Chancellor has taken up the issue with the Sentencing Council. But he needs to do his homework, because the proposal that he complains about was drafted in 2024. And the last government was consulted. And when they were consulted, what did they say? They said they welcomed the proposal. Now, Mr. Speaker, I understand that the Shadow Justice Secretary is taking the Sentencing Council to court. Perhaps he should add himself as the second defendant so we can get to the back of the ballroom.
Tulip City.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to represent a constituency that has 8 synagogues, a thriving Jewish population, and the UK's largest Jewish cultural centre, JW3. But this week, I was horrified to read reports about rising anti-Semitism on NHS wards, and in particular, a shocking incident in which a Jewish NHS staff member was called a baby killer by their colleague. The NHS that I know and love is open to everyone, regardless of their background. So could I ask the Prime Minister, what is he doing to ensure that my Jewish constituents can safely use our beloved National Health Service?
Well, I thank her for raising these deeply concerning reports. It is completely unacceptable for anyone to experience racism, discrimination or prejudice in the health service. I know my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, takes such reports extremely seriously. It is a fundamental principle that the NHS provides care and treatment for everyone, regardless of race, faith or background. This is a really serious issue. You've let yourself down, you know it. I expect all trusts and healthcare providers to take necessary action against any staff who've expressed views that do not reflect the views and values of the NHS.
Dave Dugan, a closed question.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, he asked about UK-US relations. As he knows and the House knows, I'm committed to strengthening those relations. The US is an indispensable ally. We are working together to try to secure a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. And I've spoken to the President on a number of occasions, including this week.
Dave Dugan.
I agree with the Prime Minister in those sentiments. The ceasefire negotiations this week are a cause for great optimism, and I welcome the efforts that the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, had done in leading that priority. But last week at the dispatch box, the Prime Minister said in answer to my right honourable friend, the member for Aberdeen South, that he had no knowledge of the United States planning to withdraw military aid from Ukraine, yet they did that the following day. It's against that backdrop, because I know the Prime Minister wants a just and lasting peace in Ukraine that respects Ukraine's borders and territorial integrity. When he's impressing that priority upon the President of the United States, what reassurance can he give the House today that the President of the United States is actually listening?
Let me give this reassurance. As soon as that step was taken, I and my team started work to try and ensure that we could get back to a situation of full support for Ukraine. I won't detail everything that was involved over the last week. I can assure him and the House a huge amount of hard work, discussions and diplomacy was used with all of our allies and others to ensure that we could get yesterday to go as well as we hoped it would. I am pleased that we've made progress. I think that's very important for Ukraine, and I'm extremely pleased that support has been put in, backed by the US, for Ukraine. So that's what I did once I understood what had happened. I'm pleased with where we've got to, but as ever, we must go further.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Disabled people in my constituency are frightened. And they're frightened because they're again hearing politicians use the language of tough choices. And they know from bitter experience that when politicians talk about tough choices, it means the easy option of making the poor and vulnerable pay. So instead of cutting benefits for disabled people, wouldn't the moral thing to do, the courageous thing to do, be to make a real tough choice and introduce a wealth tax on the very wealthiest people in our society?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the party opposite left a broken welfare system which locks millions out of work. That is indefensible, in my view, economically and morally. Of course, we need to support people who need support. We need to help those who want to work to get back into work, and I think there's a moral imperative in that. He talks about a wealth tax. We have raised money, the energy profits levy, taxing non-doms and air passenger duty on private jets. But this isn't a bottomless pit, and we must kick-start growth to get the economic stability that we need.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Most people would accept that we need more housing in this country, yet so often it's not accompanied by the necessary infrastructure. In my own constituency, thousands of houses are proposed, yet without the 250 million to upgrade Junction 12 of the M5, the inspector is likely to rule our plan unsound. So will the Prime Minister use his upcoming planning and infrastructure bill to see how developer and landowner contributions can more effectively build this vitally needed infrastructure which would benefit communities up and down the country?
Well, he's right. We have to get the houses built that we need in his constituency and elsewhere, something that the party opposite failed to do. That's why we've introduced the infrastructure bill, which I think he welcomes, and that bill will get Britain building so we can deliver on those 1.5 million new homes through our plan for change. In relation to the particular issue he raises, I know that he and my honourable friend, the member for Stroud, have been working together to try to resolve this issue as I understand it, and I'm happy to ensure he gets a meeting with the relevant minister if that would help in taking it further.
Sir Jean Joseph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend this Labour government's landmark reforms to get Britain building through our plan for change? Yes. I look forward to working with ministers to ensure developers deliver on what they promise to local residents, so that new homes also have access to roads, GP surgeries and dentists, and don't create an extra burden on hospitals like the William Harvey Hospital in my Ashford constituency. What is the Prime Minister's message to the blockers standing in the way of the homes and vital infrastructure our country needs?
Well, he's a dedicated campaigner for his constituents. Well, we know who's been standing in the way for the past 14 years. It's the party opposite, and they've learned absolutely nothing. The leader of the opposition claims that she's never opposed growth or development. That's not what she's telling her constituents, Mr. Speaker. Only last month she wrote in her newsletter that she'll keep working with Conservative colleagues to block a vital energy infrastructure project in her own backyard. She's not alone. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, Shadow Defence Secretary, Shadow DEFRA, they're all at it. What a bunch of blockers.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Mr. Speaker, the Employment Rights Bill will grant union equality representatives the right to paid time off work.
And it does.
Will the Prime Minister grant special constables the right to take unpaid leave to perform their duties?
I'm grateful to him for raising the question of special constables who play a very important role in our communities and keeping us safe. The numbers of special constables dropped under the last government. We support the existing employer-supported policing scheme and will support our special constables, but they dropped under the last government.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Long time.
I recently visited Middlesbrough's James Cook University Hospital and learned of the brilliant work in the neurosciences department for the survivors of stroke, brain and spinal injuries and many others. but it only has 18 rehabilitation beds to serve a population of some 1.4 million people, whereas the guidelines say it needs 80 beds, meaning that patients in the Tees Valley do not get the rehabilitation they need. So will the government remedy the position by ensuring that resources are allocated to meet the ambition to develop a world-class new rehabilitation centre to serve the Tees Valley and beyond?
Well, I thank him for his question. It is important to hear about the important work that James Cook Hospital is doing in his constituency. We are investing £350,000 in research on interventions which support people with functional neurological disorders to rehabilitate them within the community. And of course, our plan for change invested £25 billion to cut waiting lists, speed up treatment and shift more care into the community. In relation to the hospital, I'll make sure he gets a meeting with the Minister to see what further can be done.
Sir John Whittington. Will the Prime Minister look at the case of my constituents, Mr and Mrs Adrian Fenton, who returned home from visiting France in their motorhome to discover an illegal immigrant concealed in the bike rack? They reported it immediately to the police, only to receive a fine from the Border Force of £1,500. Will he agree that my constituents ought to be thanked rather than punished? And does he accept that this action will send a message to deter anybody from acting responsibly in the future?
Can I thank him for raising this important case on behalf of his constituents? I've seen some of the details and I am concerned about it, and I do think it's important, as he says, that the Home Office look into it, and therefore we will do so, and I'll make sure that he is updated in relation to that in due course.
Richard Dowd.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Veterans in Sefton, one of the many remarkable charities in my constituency, indicate that statistics can only partly measure the price paid by servicemen and women. Incidents of broken marriages, suicides, alcoholism, deep depression and homelessness among veterans remain largely unquantified. Given that, will my right honourable friend restate Labour's commitment to providing our veterans the holistic support they need and deserve?
Well, we owe an extraordinary debt to our veterans, Mr Speaker. We are committed to renewing the nation's contract with those who've served, and that includes the guarantees of homes for heroes for those who have served, dedicated mental and physical healthcare pathways in the NHS, and dedicated to sport to help those leaving service using their skills to find new and fulfilling careers.
Sarah Dyke.
Yesterday, with no notice, DEFRA closed SFI applications, leaving thousands of farmers who want to deliver public goods waiting for a year without support. So can the Prime Minister assure British farmers that they won't be left stranded, unable to support environmental and food resilience goals due to lack of government support?
Well, Mr Speaker, as she knows, the SFI schemes have operated to provide quite considerable support so far. There have been a number of schemes. They've closed in the past, and then a new scheme has been put in place. They were closed in 2022 and 2023 by the party opposite without the 6 weeks' notice. But we do support farmers. We will be putting forward more details at the spending review. But the difference, Mr Speaker, in this government is we're funding the farmers. They failed to spend the budget.
Sultana.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In October 2023, in an interview with LBC, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "I think Israel does have that right," when asked if cutting off power and water to Gaza was appropriate. For 11 days now, Israel has blocked the entry of vital goods and aid into Gaza, subjecting over 2 million people to collective punishment and starvation. Israel's decision to also cut off electricity to a plant supplying drinking water to 500,000 people is yet another blatant violation of international law and further evidence of genocide against the Palestinian people. In light of these facts, does the Prime Minister still maintain that Israel is not committing genocide?
Look, I'm really appalled by Israel blocking aid when it is needed at greater volume and speed than it's ever been needed. Blocking goods and supplies and power entering Gaza risks breaching international humanitarian law, and it shouldn't be happening. And we are doing everything we can to alleviate that situation.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his extremely important upcoming discussions with other nations about Ukraine, will the Prime Minister focus on the fact that it was standard Russian procedure to take over other countries by having bogus elections and installing puppet governments? And will he therefore impress on other colleagues to be very wary of calls to hold elections in Ukraine during a wartime situation, which could result in the subversion and takeover by Russia of the entire country?
I thank him for raising a really important point, and the track record is there for all to see. On top of that, of course, we in this country did not hold elections when we were at war. That is a perfectly reasonable and normal course of behaviour. And yes, of course, that has to be part of our discussions as we go forward, including the meeting that I'm convening on Saturday.
Lord Hatton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. South Dorset is ready to play its part, making Britain a clean energy superpower. But after 14 years of Conservative failure, there are many untapped opportunities on our doorstep. Green investment opportunities such as Port Wind, Moor Wind and a hydrogen storage hub are all coming down the track. So can the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that the government will work with the Crown Court on these projects, invest in key infrastructure and ensure that South Dorset's green energy potential is hardwired into our plan for change?
Well, I thank him. He's absolutely right about making Britain a clean energy superpower. We are committing £2.3 billion to support hydrogen projects, and I recognise the huge potential of South Dorset to become home to a storage hub. We're ensuring public and private investment works together, and that's exactly what the Crown Estate Act does, unlocking significant investment, boosting offshore wind and kick-starting economic growth.
Andrew Rossendale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Leader of the Opposition has already mentioned, later today the Prime Minister will meet the family of our dear late colleague, Sir David Amess, who was so brutally murdered at his constituency surgery 3.5 years ago. I plead with the Prime Minister to reverse the decision to deny the family a public inquiry, despite similar inquiries being held into other tragic instances. So, will he please stop this shameful saga and heed the call of the Amess family for a judge-led public inquiry into David's death and the related failure of the Prevent programme from a heartbroken family?
Can I acknowledge just how heartbroken they are? It's difficult to imagine what they've gone through, what they continue to go through. And that's why it's very important that I meet them this afternoon, which I will do, and discuss with them all the questions they want to raise with me. Sir David was a respected and loved a colleague across this House, and as I say, I absolutely understand how his family must feel about the tragic circumstances in which he died and then everything that followed thereafter.
Final question, Chris Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow marks 29 years since 16 children and their teacher were murdered at Dunblane Primary School. In recent weeks, my constituents have raised with me the alarming fact that adverts offering handguns for sale are appearing on technology platforms like Google and YouTube. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that technology companies have an obligation to all of us to do everything proactively possible to prevent illegal advertising of this kind and not rely on a reactive, will remove it when it's reported approach, which is simply not good enough?
The thoughts, I'm sure, of the whole House are with the victims of the Dunblane massacres 29 years after the tragic event. The Online Safety Act will require online services to proactively remove such content from their platforms and prevent it appearing there in the first place. These duties fully take effect from Monday, and then we'll make sure that all companies meet their obligations.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Yes, it brings us to the end of this week's session of PMQs. Let me introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the government, we have the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander. For the opposition, for the Conservatives, we have Shadow Treasury Minister Gareth Davis, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, is here too. Vicky, before we talk about the economy, it was a sort of traditional Punch and Judy session, if you like, from Kemi Badenoch asking questions of Keir Starmer. Let me just tell and remind viewers who are watching there that we heard that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is going to meet the family of Sir David Amess, who was murdered, Tory MP, who was murdered at his constituency surgery just over 3 years ago. It was raised by Kemi Badenoch, and we heard a plea there from the Conservative MP Andrew Rossendale for the government to reconsider what the decision that they've made. We can show you the headline here. They've rejected a call from the family for a public inquiry into what happened and the situation surrounding his death. So, Heidi, should the government reconsider that?
Well, I think, as you heard the Prime Minister say, he will be meeting with David's family later today. David was a lovely man. I knew him personally, and his death, his murder, alongside that of Joe Cox, I think is something that affects parliamentarians across the political divide very deeply. And so I know that the Prime Minister will listen very intently to what David's family have got to say this afternoon. I respect the fact that they will want answers and closure, and I'm sure that the Prime Minister will listen carefully to the case that they make.
I mean, it sounds as if it could be reviewed because the news is very recent that the government's rejected that call. It was a very emotional press conference given by David Amess's daughter, one of his daughters, and she couldn't understand why there wouldn't be an inquiry. Would you like to see the government say yes to an inquiry into what happened?
Well, look, I think it's right that the Prime Minister sits down with David's family and listens to what they've got to say. I haven't followed all of the detail on this, but I think the fact that the Prime Minister is meeting them is a reflection of how seriously and how sensitively we want to approach this issue.
Let's return to the main thrust of Kemi Badenoch's questions. It was, as I say, very much on familiar territory, on the economy. She's returned to what she sees as the fallout of the budget last October from Rachel Reeves. She said to the Prime Minister, you've got no idea what people are experiencing, and listed a litany of people and groups that have been affected, whether it's nurseries or councils or companies and businesses, particularly with that increase in national insurance contributions for employers. She very much wants to make it political choices the government has made, and the Prime Minister wants to say, no, we're fixing the mistakes and the inheritance that you left us. It's interesting, it comes just a few weeks before we're expecting Rachel Reeves to come back with some sort of statement. What did you make of it?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that Kemi Badenoch is trying to now say that that's an emergency budget, something that the government was obviously not saying. But there will be elements in that weren't expected before. So if we look at what might happen with welfare cuts, for example, Rachel Reeves is having to find some money here because she wants to balance the book. She doesn't want to break her fiscal rules. So she is slightly looking around for changes and for money that she can find. But what Kemi Badenoch was doing there, was really with this thread of the national insurance rise, suggesting the government hadn't really thought through or was unaware of the consequences there might be, as you say, for all sorts of areas of society and how it's affecting people, whether it might be with your council tax, your care homes, nurseries, all sorts of areas. So I think, everyone now really looking ahead to that statement at the end of March and exactly how Rachel Reeves is going to come forward and show that she's not not breaking her rules, that she's not going to borrow more, and that she can fund the things that she wants to fund, including defence spending, which, of course, another thing that's going up.
I mean, do you concede it is an emergency? She wasn't intending to come back in the way that she probably will do in 2 weeks' time.
Rachel was always going to make a spring statement. We've committed to one fiscal event a year. We were very clear that that budget in October was a once-in-a-parliament event to wipe the slate clean. We did inherit a multi-billion-pound deficit, and the situation was far worse than we anticipated it was going to be when we walked in to those government departments. And so, you know, we have set out how we are going to pay for investment in public services. When I was standing in the election last year, it was very clear to me that people did want to see us make progress on things like the NHS waiting list.
Yes.
We've had those waiting lists coming down now for 4 months in a row. And so that's a really big priority. And of course, any government, if it's going to invest in public services, needs to say where the money is coming from.
Gareth, what's the problem?
I think the problem is that, and as this is why Kemi led on this today, is that across the country, people are feeling the pinch, and they're feeling a pinch that they didn't expect because they were told that national insurance tax would not go up. And the first thing that they did in the budget in the autumn was put that up for so many businesses across the country, but not just businesses. It's nurseries. The average nursery will have a £47,000 increase in cost. That means that the cost of nursery for hardworking families will go up. And so today I think she spoke for millions across the country, not just the dismay at the broken promise, but the impact that it's having on real people's lives. And we would just encourage Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer to get out in the country to listen to how bad this is really affecting businesses and organisations.
I mean, I do have to correct you. We were clear in our manifesto that we wouldn't increase income tax, VAT or national insurance on working people. We took the difficult decision to increase national insurance employers' contributions. We also put some protections in place for the smallest businesses. And Gareth will be aware that 3/4 of the money that is raised through the national insurance employers increase comes from the very largest businesses, which employ over 250 people. Yes. So we have put those protections in place for smaller businesses.
But Heidi Alexander, do you concede now, listening to the debate we've just heard in the chamber, that the budget, that increase in national insurance contributions has had a negative impact on employment?
I'm not immune to the impact that putting up national insurance employers' contributions has on some businesses. I think it was necessary in order to invest in public services. I would also say since the election last year, we have seen interest rates come down 3 times. We've seen 70,000 new jobs created. We are seeing wages going up faster than prices at the moment. And so I don't
that's because inflation is lower than it has been for some time. But you do concede, you do accept that that budget has had a negative impact on employment, on jobs, and it has also had the consequence of many companies and firms putting up their prices, so hitting working people.
So I think, look at the 70,000 positions that have been created since the election. We are also raising the national minimum wage, which I think is welcomed by the 3 million people that will be in receipt of that. We have had to take those difficult decisions to raise money for public services. But given that we needed more teachers in our schools and we had to get the NHS waiting list down, the money had to come from somewhere. And that is what is, you know, so cynical, really, of the opposition's position in not stating where the money is going to come from for the investment in public services that they say that they want.
Where is the money going to come from? I mean, Keir Starmer's right. Kemi Badenoch hasn't said she would reverse those NIC increases. So where would the money come from?
First of all, we voted against the budget. We would not have made the choices that Rachel Reeves
But you haven't pledged to reverse
recklessly implemented. We have set out very clearly that we would make very different choices. For example, GB Energy is costing the taxpayer £8 billion. National Wealth Fund rebrand of an existing organisation is costing £7 billion. They paid £9 billion to give massive pay rises to train drivers who are already pushing nearly £100,000 a year. I think the public can see straight through what is going on here, and they would just urge, like we are, the government to rethink this, because it is businesses and nurseries and hospices and charities and all these organisations across the country are paying additional tax, a tax that they were promised would not go up.
Gareth, I'm not going to apologise for resolving the industrial action on the railways or in our hospitals, because that's a huge problem for people across the country. And our public sector workers got a decent pay rise for the first time in years. And so I'm not going to apologise for that, because I think that was the right thing to do. And I think if you look at the fact that wages, if you think that wages, well, I will never make that commitment, because anyone
resolved it. You just paid £9 billion to resolve it in your words.
To be honest,
you can't say.
To be honest, as someone who has ran a public service before, there will be occasions on which strikes will be necessary because the trade unions are wrong.
Waste of £9 billion.
No, not at all.
When you're putting up taxes on farmers and nurseries.
We had rolling national strikes that on the railways cost the taxpayer over 2 years £850 million in lost revenue.
I don't think that's right. That's a lot less than £9 billion.
Right. I mean, let's come on to one of the things that you raised, Vicky, which is savings in welfare. Perhaps that is where the government is going to find significant amounts of money so that Rachel Reeves can balance the books, meet her fiscal rules. How big a problem is this for Labour MPs?
Well, I mean, we saw a little bit of it there, didn't we, in Prime Minister's questions. So Richard Bergen, who had the whip, he was being booted out of the Parliamentary Labour Party but has been accepted back in. You know, he raised this issue and said disabled people in his constituency were frightened. Now, Keir Starmer spoke to the Parliamentary Labour Party earlier in the week to make the case, saying that there was a moral imperative to help people who can work back into work. He says the system locks people out of work and that is indefensible. But what is interesting here is there is a debate bubbling away. And if you go back to the overseas aid budget being slashed, you know, the resignation of Annalisa Dodds, the minister in charge of that, she has also raised this issue of maybe bringing in a different kind of wealth tax, for example. So there is a bit of a debate bubbling away. I don't think we're at the stage of a mass rebellion amongst Labour MPs. But of course, many of them are very worried about this possibility of £5 or £6 billion being cut from the budget, particularly PIP, personal independence payments, which go to those who are disabled, that they are very uneasy about some of that.
Well, I mean, how comfortable are you about it, Heidi Alexander? We have spoken to Labour MPs who are deeply unhappy about it. Can you reassure viewers, will some people currently on disability benefits, will they lose them? Will they lose them under these reforms that the Prime Minister is talking about?
So I think we've inherited a broken system and we can't go on the way that we are at the moment because, as we heard in Prime Minister's questions, I think it was John Slinger from Rugby stood up and pointed out that 1 in 8 young people in the country aren't in employment, education or training. 1 in 10 working age adults are out of the workforce and are on health or sickness related benefits. 1 in 10. That equates to 2.8 million people, a city the size of Greater Manchester.
So you're going to push some people off benefits you think shouldn't be on them?
We will make sure that people who genuinely can't work and need that safety net do have a safety net. But we do need to look at how we get more people into work. We need to be a country that is working, and that's what Liz Kendall, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions,
well, they're going to do.
Will be setting out some plans in the next couple.
Well, maybe
of weeks.
they're going to do the government what you failed to do and said you would, rightly or wrongly. In fact, the government, ironically, has your support here. The dissent is from within.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what the details are yet of the announcement. It seems to get pushed and pushed and pushed because Labour are in such disarray and disagreement that we have no idea what they're going to do. But clearly we do need to tackle the welfare system. Post-COVID, obviously, it increased significantly and we were taking action to tackle that, and we would encourage and support the government as they seek to do it if they can get their own side on track with this. But I think it's also important to just stress that you've got to create the environment in the economy where jobs can be created by businesses. And we brought in a condition whereby 4 million jobs since 2010 were created in our economy. We have this situation now because of the national insurance increase that's going to hit in April, where businesses are now saying they're going to have to freeze or cut employment, and that is completely at odds.
I mean,
with
whatever you were doing at the end of the last government wasn't working. We are a global outlier. We are one of the only major economies where the employment rate hasn't recovered since the pandemic. So we had 14 years. I recognise COVID was difficult, but in that last couple of years, no progress was made.
Right, can I just ask both of you, do you support cutting the amount of benefit that claimants currently get in disability? The amount?
I think we need to look at whether for example, if you're on disability or sickness benefits, whether the uplift that you are getting is proportionate to the additional support that you need. And I think it's reasonable for a government to look at the quantum. I also think we need to think about what trajectory we're on over time. And if we look at the projected increase in the welfare bill, it's tens of billions of pounds more over the next couple of years. If we don't do something to change the system and get some of those people who are currently on incapacity benefits, who want to work, they say to us they want to work, we need to get them support and match to the employment opportunities that are there.
But looking at the quantum, as I would understand it, does mean in some cases that some people are on benefits that are perhaps too generous.
So we're going to have to look and work out how we get the right support to the right people, because that safety net is really critical for people who genuinely can't work. But we're clear, those who can work should be working.
And Gareth, the same question as well to this about if savings are made, how much of those savings might go back into the system, if you like. So, for example, some of the people who are claiming these benefits, especially the young people, it will be to do with mental health issues. So should some of that money go back in to boost mental health support, therapies, all the rest of it, counselling, which anyone who's tried to get that through the NHS, it's incredibly difficult. Or is that money basically being siphoned off to the Treasury to fill some of their gaps?
Well, I mean, Gareth, what do you think? Should the amount of money going to some people on disability, so claimants who are claiming for their disability, should that be reduced?
Look, the broader point, if I may start with...
Well, it's easy to make the broader point, but these are the specifics and people... No, but I'm asking you for a principle, and should that go down?
I'll give you the principle, which is that the welfare system should support the most vulnerable in society, including disabled people.
Yeah.
But we, in the March budget of last year, introduced a series of reforms and measures and funding to ensure that those who are disabled, who want to work, who can work, can get back into the workforce. And that is absolutely critical. And we were going to, if we'd won the election, significantly carry on that work to reduce the overall welfare.
Although the Institute for Fiscal Studies said that amount they didn't think really added up.
They were wrong about that, and they said that in 2010 when we had the same policy, and we proved them wrong. We cut the welfare budget by £12 billion, and so they were wrong at that.
Just to say, we have a special programme for that statement by Rachel Reeves in exactly 2 weeks' time, so put it in your diaries now. I just want to refer to something else that Keir Starmer said in response to a question at Prime Minister's Questions, which is really pleased with the progress that has resulted in a truce, a temporary 30-day ceasefire, been agreed by Ukraine and the US. Now, as the American Secretary of State said, it's very much in Russia's court to see what happens. But when it comes to trade, do you think the Prime Minister's approach is working, bearing in mind those tariffs on aluminium and steel have just come in at 25%?
So I think it's important to remember that the tariffs on steel and aluminium are global tariffs that have been applied internationally. We are currently in discussions with the US about a wider economic agreement. Obviously, it's disappointing that those tariffs have come in, but we are taking a pragmatic approach so that we can protect the interests of businesses and the UK economy.
The Shadow Trade Secretary said the Prime Minister or somebody should be camped outside the offices of either the Oval Office of Mar-a-Lago to get that carve-out. Is that what you would advocate?
We've heard so many warm words, pragmatic approach. Get on with it. We had a trade agreement ready to go until Donald Trump lost the first term of the election.
Did you?
And we did. We were absolutely far advanced in terms of getting a deal. Joe Biden killed it. We hear a lot of warm words over here from the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Get on with it. Get on with a trade deal. This would kill the issue of tariffs in our country. This is going to push up inflation. They've already put up inflation by 1% because of the budget, this horrendous budget. these tariffs are going to hurt businesses and employers and all sorts of people additionally.
Let me get a response from you, Heidi Alexander, because you are the Transport Secretary and you've been overseeing the response here. BBC News headline, this was the development earlier today, arrested captain of ship is Russian national. This is in the wake of the collision in the North Sea, a cargo ship with an oil tanker. What can you tell us, Heidi?
So there has been a male that has been arrested by Humberside police and is helping with their investigations. The two boats at the moment are still in the North Sea. The one that collided into the larger vessel has been towed away from the coastline. The fire is out on the larger vessel, and the extent and intensity of the fire on the smaller vessel, the Solong, is much less than it was yesterday, and we haven't witnessed any further pollution emanating from either vessel. And so I met with the Chief Executive of the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency yesterday. I would like to say that my thoughts are with the family member of the crew member who is missing and is sadly presumed dead at this stage. And I would like to thank all of the frontline workers who responded so swiftly over the last 48 hours.
I mean, are we any closer to understanding the cause of this crash?
So there will be an investigation that is carried out by the Maritime Accident Investigation Branch, and so I don't want to get ahead of that. And I don't want to comment on a live police investigation, but a very thorough investigation will take place.
Right. It's obviously extremely important that, as you said, the vessels are kept afloat, and it looks like that is the case.
That is the latest intelligence that I have, that both of the vehicles, both of the vessels rather, are afloat at the moment. And we believe that they will remain so. There is significant damage to both vessels. The larger vessel, which is the Immaculate, which was the anchored ship, we think that the salvage companies will be able to get on that ship later today. On the smaller vessel, the Solong, there is that's in a worse state.
All right, thank you very much for bringing us up to date. Thank you both for joining us today after Prime Minister's Questions, and of course to you, Vicky Young. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15, and don't forget that special programme on the finance statement in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.